Moving on with complex numbers. So up above, we just went over a complex number is a plus bi. Then we have our real numbers, or -1, 5/3. That's when the I part of your complex is 0. And then our imaginary numbers, a plus bi, is when you're going to have both the real and the imaginary together. And then purely imaginary numbers is when the a part is 0 and you just have the 4i, the 6i. So purely imaginary just as an I. Imaginary, which we build on our complex, is a real part with an imaginary part, and then we just have real numbers which don't have the imaginary part. Now the question is, well, where do these numbers come from? And these numbers come from taking a square root of a negative number. So at its simplest form, we look at the square root of -1. And we've been taught that if we're taking a square root, so for example, if I'm taking the square root of 4, well, that would be 2 times 2, which is 2. And for the sake of being correct here, I'm not going to put an equal sign. But we would take 4, we'd break it down into 2 times 2. The first one would get out of jail. The second one would die. So the answer to the square root of 4 is 2. Well, if I try to do that with a negative number, I can't do 1 times 1. I can't do -1 times -1. It's not going to work. So what we do is we say that this is I. It's imaginary. You can't actually do it because there's no two things that will multiply to a negative number. So the square root of a negative number is where we get I from. Example 1. Find the square root of each number. So we're going to start out with the square root of -25. Now I'm going to start and do this the long way, and then after I do it the long way, I'm going to do it the shorter way. So if I have this, I'm going to rewrite this as -1 times 25, because -1 times 25 is still -25. Then I'm going to rewrite that as the square root of -1 times the square root of 25, which is still the same thing. If it's the square root of -1 times 25, then I can rewrite it as a square root and a square root still being multiplied. Now, here is where the problem is. This is the imaginary part. That's I. I don't know what the square root of a -1 is. That's I. But the square root of 25, I know how to do that. That's 5 times 5, so that's 5, and we're still multiplying. So ultimately, the answer to this is 5i. Now, that's kind of the long way, the process of what is actually happening. But if we want to shorten that, this is what I typically do. I typically go, okay, I don't like the negative inside the square root, so I'm going to bring it out. I'm going to make it an I, which now leaves that as the square root of 25. After that, I look at 25. I know that that's 5 times 5. This guy's going to get out. This guy's not. That's 5. And then I take my I, tack it on the back, and there you go. Letter B. Square root of -72. So once again, we can kind of break this down as -1 times 72, but I'm just going to go the short way. I'm going to say, okay, I don't like the negative. That's going to come out, and that's going to become an I. Then we're just dealing with the square root of 72. At this point, I'm going to break it down. I know that that's 9 times 8. 9 is going to break down into 3 times 3. 8 is going to break down into 4 times 2. And then 4 is going to break down into 2 times 2. At this point, 3 and 3 can pair up, so I'm going to have a 3. 2 and 2 can pair up, so I'm going to have a 2. And then this 2 doesn't have a buddy, so he is going to go back inside. Then I'm going to remember over here that I had this I on the outside, so I'm just going to tuck it right in there behind my 3 and my 2. If I simplify this, I have a 3 times a 2, which is a 6, I root 2, and there's your answer. Letter C, -5 times the square root of -9. Same idea, The negative on the outside is not a problem. We don't need to worry about that. It's the negative on the inside that I'm going to bring out, and I'm just going to kind of tuck right there. So we're going to have a negative 5i, and then square root, and now that I took my negative out, positive 9. Square root of 9, I should know is 3, but if I don't, I can break it down. This guy's going to come out. This guy's not going to make it, so I'm going to have a 3. Now, nobody else goes back inside because the square root of 9 is simply 3. So on the outside, I still have a negative 5i. I'm bringing the 3 out with it, so we're going to multiply, which is going to give me negative 15i, and you're done.